Eric.
Omar.
I was doing a Valsalva right there. Okay, I'm bracing for the episode, as should everyone listening to this episode, because folks, yeah, we're gonna declare it. Okay, we're being very adamant on this one. It's a monster episode. There's no other way of getting around it, and we haven't even started recording, but we just know it's going to be a monster episode.
There's no question. This is like when you go to a monster truck rally.
Yep.
You don't just expect to see trucks, and this isn't just a podcast.
Yeah.
You know, this is a monster podcast. You've attended a monster episode, for sure.
Yeah, what was the name of like that one monster truck? I just remember the ads of Sunday, Sunday, Sunday for like Iron Culture.
Grave Digger.
That's the name. Was there only one monster? Everyone remembers Grave Digger. Name a second one, Eric, right now. I can't.
Grave Digger. I have no idea. I went to one maybe
Wait, pause.
25 years ago. Like I think I was 9 with a friend.
Nice.
And all I remember was that even through the little earplugs I was given, it was so incredibly loud, and there was some flames, and there's a lot of people yelling. It wasn't really for me.
Yeah, it's Eric. I'm surprised you or other people didn't suffer like a perforated eardrum, because that like lot of what? Because for a lot of people, some of those events, like there was, I'll never actually forget this, just to show the lack of rigorous rules and kind of making sure everything is up to code, up to spec. I remember there was a metal band from the late 80s that played, I believe it was Budokan. Again, this is a pop culture reference that only 25% is true. The part that is true, there was a metal band that played in Japan in either the late 80s or early 90s, because they were a hair metal band. Anyways, it wasn't the audio, they had a laser show, and part of the laser show, because again, they didn't calibrate, like these are actual lasers of too high of an intensity, a certain portion of the audience, I don't know if it's a couple or whatever, became either partially blinded or outright blinded, and it was a huge lawsuit. But I'm just saying that there's some of these situations, such as, I wouldn't be surprised, because when you look at like how our ears function and just like the decibels and everything else and like the risks, that was not a consideration, I'm saying, for the planners. For your ears, like your well-being was definitely, you seeing Gravedigger, they weren't thinking of little helms that would grow up to be big zaddy helms, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just as a disclaimer, everything that we state about monster truck rallies and historical lawsuit-inducing light shows in international hair metal events may or may not be evidence-based, folks. But we promise a good portion of the rest of the podcast will be.
Will be, yeah. And it's actually very relevant, because we are talking about everyone's favorite topic, a little bit of steroids, a little bit of aesthetics. We'll get to that, but please let us banter, because now we have, thanks to our main man himself, we have timestamps. So you can go ahead and jump ahead if you want. I do want to respond just to a few lovely comments and then 2 reviews, because the cult shows up and we respect the cult, and thus we want to read and we want to platform some of these reviews and some of these conversations. We want to amplify some of these things. But we had D. Lennon on. It was a great episode, by the way. There was apparently some minor controversy of the title, killing it for over a decade, with Danny Lennon.
I don't see why.
Yeah. That was us being emphatic in terms of how well they were doing. But you have 2 stalkers. I do want you to note that. I did notice that in the comments, where someone said, "You're in Australia, Eric? Are you in Sydney? Can we hang out?" That was a serious comment by someone. Fantastic. And then the guy Zygmunt, who was giving some of that Aussie banter before, was said, "Mate, as in Oz, hope you brushed up on the language, you big sea hunt." Nice one, fellas. So it's like, hey, Eric travels. Eric has his entourage. He has a litany of followers just waiting. Okay.
Hey, and it was a privilege and a pleasure to be in Australia. I was hanging out in Brisbane for the Sports Nutrition Association annual conference. Big shout out to the Prez, Alex Thomas, and no, it was great. So I had a quick little hop over the pond from New Zealand, and Danny and Alan spent at least 4 days trying to travel to get there. As they were coming from literally the other side of the planet. Yeah. So yeah, no, but seriously, they came there. They both killed it. Maybe Danny a little more so. Yeah. Just something about his sharp delivery. I think he really does kill it quite regularly. Yeah. But I don't know what the controversy was, Omar. I think people these days are just looking for something. I feel like they just have, they have like murderous intent, proverbially, of course, when it comes to this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, there's a lot to be said, and I'll move forward because someone said maybe you should try to get that guy Derek T-Rex on again. I got the feeling he would love to be on a podcast that did not yet, in parentheses, sell out.
Yeah, well, he has a limited amount of time because people are knocking on our door. I tell you what, corporate sponsors. Don't ask me who.
Yeah,
but we got. I fully expect we'll be contacted by Gravedigger's manager after this episode to see if we want to actually officially bring up Gravedigger as the Iron Culture monster truck.
Thank you.
So
I thought you were going to say, Eric,
we'll have to look at it.
I thought you were going to say Gravedigger's manager is feeling litigious, where it's like, what did you just say about Gravedigger? It's like, oh, no. Eric, to be clear, 9-year-old Eric had the time of his life. Okay.
Yeah, and I will not be blaming my ringing ears that I'm now noticing for the first time in 25 years on Gravedigger. But if I did, you know what? Even if he was feeling litigious, he doesn't want none of Team Pyramids out in Delaware. So,
right.
Bring it.
Yeah.
And as in, please don't sue us because we don't actually have a legal team.
Wow. Eric, someone said honorable mentions for future guests. I would read over a few of them, but what's actually interesting, I would ask everyone, because someone left a comment saying they started listening this year. Half of the people recommended as guests, like what's our lad's name? Jackson Payos. Like we had him on. So there, I would say literally 50%. They're a great list. We had about 50% on. So just check out, our previous episodes. Maybe you could search. I do think you could search in Apple iTunes, certainly on YouTube. Then someone said, I freaking love Rascal Apparel podcast, way better than Macro Factor podcast. Surely love it when you could tell the difference between show and ads and how the hosts are separated from advertising products they have relations to.
I love it. And, this is something I've written about in mass.
Conflicts of interest.
Yeah. It's not even true.
And then lastly, the last comment before I read two quick reviews, because they're just so on point, is Rick Lee said, we all know it's just a matter of months before one fine Tuesday morning, we are treated to a monster episode responding to an Instagram comment related to cereal health.
Tuesday in the parts of the world that are one day ahead of other parts of the world, just to be clear. And that comment is only in those contexts acceptable.
Eric, that was a beautiful teaching moment on your part where you let people know that they thought America was just neatly defined by its states and some of its territories. And you said, folks, you need to understand how time zones work. And it dispelled, we did so many things at once. You basically dispelled the notion that the earth was flat, like just many things at the same time. We reasserted just sanity into the public discourse. So thank you for that. The two reviews I want to say quickly, I'll have you react to both and then we'll get to the topic. The first, because honestly, the guy gave a 5 out of 5 and we are going to be biased and then read it. It's the two most recent reviews. Anyone listening, you could leave a rating review. Apple iTunes, we're not beholden to Apple at all. I've never eaten an apple a day in my life. You could probably tell I look like I have scurvy. But that's where we read the reviews. Amazing show, Eric, 5 out of 5. T-Freight 94. I'm glad he said this, though. Love the banter, one, but Eric's line that if you spend money, it will come, basically the feel the cream, was genius. I was laughing out loud when you said that. I'm glad he said that.
Hey, I'm glad that got acknowledged. Cash rules everything around me.
Yeah. My man knows. Okay. And then lastly, this, wow, I like a lot of these paragraph reviews just because they really get into it. This is C.H. Lera, L-E-R-A, the peak of the podcast pyramid, 5 out of 5. Eric and Omar are both two elite, hunky lifters that dedicate their precious time to getting their disciples yucky and swole. Every Monday, my life has changed as we have the opportunity to catch their droppings of wisdom and knowledge. Between their completely unironic love for capitalism and obscure pop culture references that Omar only gets accurate a quarter of the time, it's clear that these guys are at the top of the muscle fitness pyramids. On a serious note, the bromance really pulls off the 1-2 punch of evidence-based approaches to fitness and a layman's breakdown of the science behind it all. After the first hour of banter, the information being provided is invaluable yet always digestible. Way better than that vile Macro Factor podcast. 10 out of 10. Eric, come on!
There were so many deep cuts in that podcast that I think even Danny Lennon would be like, "Whoa, that's a deep cut."
Yeah, it was incisive. The review, like, he went anywhere and everywhere with it. And what I do love, just to take a moment of appreciation for the cult, because I do feel that we've built this community that we're certainly standing atop of. That one day we will sell out and sell our courses, in particular, probably Masculinity in Crisis. But there's others that we're developing that you're not privy to, because, to be frank, you're not worth it. That they listen to it, they get the references, and then they reflect it back and they participate in the conversation. And as you said, like, shout out to our man or woman that just left that review, because it's deep. Like, the references and everything else, the story they're weaving, fantastic. I just have appreciation.
No, that was I really actually do appreciate you for the reviewer for taking the time to interweave all of those aspects. It makes us feel seen, and obviously probably more often heard, as we have less followers on YouTube, which is fine. We're not bitter. But yeah, no, seriously, that was some excellent reviewing right there.
Eric, speaking of not being bitter, and I think it's important to be declarative when you say that, because then it's quite clear where you stand, that you're not bitter. And we made it clear that we have an audience, thus we can attack other people, because it shows that we come from a position of power, and that's how it's all about power dynamics and asserting dominance in this thing we call life. There are some very interesting topics to cover in this episode. It's a question of aesthetics. It's a question of the pursuit of aesthetics. What influences someone to want to try and transform their body? How do we define aesthetics? How the culture of lifting is influenced by content creators or organizations in order to define what are, like, being yucky, being lean, being ripped, being proportionate, being symmetrical, the changing landscape over time. And there are some really interesting, like, we'll get into it, nuanced, complex conversations to be had. The headline, I'm joking, Eric, when I say this, and we could launch off, there's many places I know we want to go here, but it's also, like, in the quest for aesthetics, maybe we'll get to the final point, but in the quest for aesthetics, how do we also avoid the pitfall of developing, body dysmorphia, or all that baggage that could come along with what in its inception is a beautiful journey, right? It's like a beautiful goal to be had.
It's a tough one, man. I think I've grappled with the philosophy and the ethics which underlie aesthetics based upon an external rubric. Many times, and to try to figure out what exactly is the delineation between something that can be positive or something that can be negative. It's a tough one. I think many times when you look at the history of this, or when you think about iconic figures and the impact they've had, a lot of the times it does come down to the marketing of aesthetics and the promotion of it to sell something, which could be an idea, like if you look at the magazine era, like the rise of Schwarzenegger, or even before that, like if you look at the classic ads that were around, decades before Arnold, of, you got sand kicked in your eye, and the male courses, not male as an MALE, although they were definitely directed at males, but like at the time when you would get these, here's how you lift, here's how you do things by this system, subscribe to our magazine, like this kind of getting bought into an entire empire of industry at the time, which definitely did exist. Sometimes people think it started with like the Weeders, but it was absolutely there beforehand, selling the idea of like masculinity with muscularity, and how to quote unquote fix these problems where you might get sand kicked in your eye, and people will take your girlfriend and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of societal problems that you can uncover just in some of these seemingly rather superficial advertising, but it is still occurring today. And it's just changed a lot, and all of that, in some ways it's interesting. It's deeply tied to bodybuilding, but it's actually quite disconnected from bodybuilding as a sport, which has changed a lot over the years, and what it needs to be and what it can be. And sometimes I do find myself sitting in a place where I'm a competitive physique athlete. I am aspiring for a certain aesthetic ideal for competition, but I feel most of the time disgusted with and concerned about the way that bodybuilding is like marketed by influencers. Sometimes who compete, sometimes who don't, you know. And it's not just the influencers. I think they're largely the symptom rather than the problem. They're kind of they're like, oh, I fit the bill for this, or I can, and I can monetize that. And I think there's probably, you know, deeper issues at play in most of these cases. So yeah.
Eric, I find this conversation fascinating. Actually, the light bulb for this, we were talking off air before coming up with this topic and deciding to discuss it. So, a little inside joke, but this is Monday now when this is being released. My first YouTube video in a while should be up, but I adapted. That's not the one that's up, but one of your mass articles. Wow, now we're promoting something, right? One of your products, mass. But the article, it's fantastic about the dangers of being shredded, or like being shredded year round, some of the potential pitfalls. But then the conversation, like the meta conversation around that is like, why would someone decide to try and be shredded year round in the first place? Is it like, and that's what, like, things are always multifaceted. There's many different layers, and they're complex in the way that they interplay with one another. Where it's like you could be doing it simultaneously for yourself, for the external validation of others, so on and so, for monetary compensation, like that's part of the like, you know, so many different things at once. But the question that is asked is like, why would someone in the first place want to go down this path where, like, when we talk even shredded, Eric, from like a physiological like barrier or like boundary, your body's actively resisting you, and this isn't a pursuit that, you know, is let's say that your body, you're doing it, you're participating, your body's like, you know what, I'm gonna go along with you, yes, let's do this. There are many things actively resisting and fighting against you, and even when you're there, it's uncomfortable. And it continues to be uncomfortable. And so there has to be the whys. So I don't even think it's a singular why necessarily for someone, but the whys have to be really strong in order for someone, the motivations to continue to do that. So the pursuit in many different ways, like we talk the umbrella of aesthetics, and maybe like we could first define that, I think would be useful, Eric, because then there's so many different distinctions. Like we could use, I do like how it's more rigid in the competitive categories of bodybuilding, where there are known categories. You could define, what does this look like? What is this aesthetic ideal we're aspiring towards? Where it's more amorphous when we talk about aesthetics in a cultural sense, because if you even look across different decades, it changes over time. So maybe before we get into the conversation actually about, you know, like the pitfalls of either like being shredded or like that, like the mindset, or like what happens, and also the feed, like that's the crazy part too, is that not an overemphasis on a particular aspect can almost, it can almost produce the exact opposite response. Well, you get lean, but then you develop so many other, you know, accessory things, like you joke about, like the eating disorders, like body dysmorphia, like whatever happens, that in your pursuit therein of something, an ideal that you have, not only do you not achieve it, but you get even further away from it, and then your relationship with yourself, and like there's so many things that occur. So first, Eric, let's step back, man. Can we define this umbrella concept of aesthetics and what we're talking about? Because all the things that come from it, where we joked about PEDs, and I'm sure we'll get to that, we'll talk about the cultural influences, the marketing, where virility is associated with all this. Let's talk just about the umbrella concept of aesthetics first, please.
Yeah, I think first I need to have like two huge disclaimers on this. Is one, if we want to do this topic justice, it shouldn't just be the two of us talking. Yep. In the future, we could have follow-ups. Yep. We're obviously just by nature going to give a relatively, you know, male and heterosexual male dominant perspective from us. Yep. And I think that's one, because we're both heterosexual males. Yeah. But two, because our followers are also largely that. And not by intent. I just want to point that out. But I think you probably resonate with people who you can relate to more easily. And without those kind of experiences of being anyone other than who I am, I'm not as effective as a communicator to those people. So anyway, that's disclaimer number one. Yep. Disclaimer number two is that I'm a sports nutritionist and a exercise scientist. And if I really wanted to define aesthetics, I think we would need a roundtable where we would have a physical and a cultural anthropologist, a social psychologist, a historian, and probably a biologist, I think, is what we would need. So, you know, this is definitely going to be a limited take, but, you know, I think it will be an important take, because we're also, with all of those caveats and all those limitations, we also are very aware of the messaging that is directed at like the young male. And while, you know, if you're one of our women listeners, or if you're, you know, someone with a different gender identity who's listening right now and you're like, yeah, this doesn't really super apply to me. I hear you. And it's not like this is going to be the end of this conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we were actually talking off air about people who would be good to have on to talk about, you know, what are the pressures for someone who might be perceived as like a female influencer. And we've had some discussion on that. We had a great one with, we've had Connor Heffernan talk about this. We've had, you know, Jess Bittner talk about this. We've had other people come on, and we will continue to do that because this is a pervasive issue that goes back through the entire history of bodybuilding.
Yep.
And it's one that does affect people in different ways. And I would actually say that the pressure that's been put upon men has always been there, and it's always been very similar, but I think it's getting to a point now where, with the rise of, you know, anabolics, the ease of access, and the rise of social media that gets people a lot earlier, you know, like I think if we were to go back, like I said, there was these crazy ass sand kicked in the face. You're not man enough if you don't have muscle, you know, and the how closely tied lifting was to masculinity. That's definitely changed because there's a ton of women who lift now. But while that has changed, and I think that's a positive thing, there is definitely a earlier access point with things like TikTok or YouTube or et cetera, to where these messages influence people at a very young age. And, you know, like you've talked about, quote unquote, SARMs goblins, or other people have talked about how quickly people get exposed to, you know, anabolic use or things like this. And I do think when it was like, oh, you have to go and purchase a magazine from a store when you're living at home and be seen physically reading it, I think it was I think by just logistical nature, your exposure to some of these messaging, say even 20 years ago, was a few years down the track. And there's a big difference. I'll speak personally here. There's a big difference between me when I was 17 and when I was 25, you know?
Eric, yeah, our prefrontal cortex barely in development, but wait, you see this young, impressionable whippersnapper talking to you about how they transform their body. Now they get all the girls that they want. They have the money, they have the car, they have the social prestige, and you can get this too if you just take 2 clicks. Oh, you might have low testosterone, actually. Maybe you should sign up for this, because that is the secret behind your lack of virility and what you've achieved in life. Just to your point, I think that's I love everything you said, man. And that's why I did want to have this conversation, and it's exploratory in nature, and we'll certainly have many more conversations, and we do have our innate bias. And I think what we see, because what resonates with us, Eric, is that we were those young lifters. We were impressionable. We did see the influence, and we could look back retrospectively that they had on us, the messaging in the bodybuilding magazines, on the forum, how... And this is maybe the part that I think is a problem. It is one of the major, how many problems are we going to get in it? Because there's many. But one of the major problems, the youth, they're impressionable, they're hungry, the need to be validated externally and to be, loved or viewed in a favorable light by others. There's a heavy emphasis on that I think in all cultures, but that FOMO that then is amplified on a place like social media, I can only imagine. And that's why I think maybe one of the places that we could go, because we're like this umbrella concept of aesthetics or like the pursuit, I say we could use a very general term, and thank you for everything you said, because you're right. Like we want something of utility to move forward. And that's what we joked. We had, I think it's actually on my YouTube channel, where we had that pain science roundtable where it's like 45 minutes of defining pain, which I think is useful, but also like for general consumption, it's like, all right, we want to get to the actual topic du jour. So let's move forward. I think the general concept of trying to change one's physical appearance, which is a very relatable concept for most people, in this specific capacity, it's usually a body composition change, which is an increase in muscle mass, a decrease over time, probably if you have some extra fat in quotations percentage you want to lose, a decrease in your body fat, and then it's a particular emphasis on different areas of your body depending upon where you're inclined to try and build your physique towards. And the question that I wonder about, Eric, and that's why you joked about how you're different from 17 to 25, man, is I thought it was at first brave, and maybe we could talk about that, but then once again, some of these pitfalls where we saw recently, Larry Wheels as an example, he was vocal, and that's what's interesting to me. Is that, and I think this is a proxy conversation to something that a lot of people will experience, and I think he's someone that's more transparent. And before I go on, I'll just say that that's why I joke about the SARM's goblins, Eric. It's another conversation, but I think we've normalized the use of PEDs in the youth by basically not the decriminalization of it, like not that, like the idea that like the social taboo, like, oh my God, I can't believe you're doing that, but because we talk about that graveyard concept, the people that go on, we only see what gets amplified by the algorithm are basically success stories. So a guy that looks really good, that seemingly has everything that you want, right? So once again, the money, the fame, the notoriety, like the partners, and one of the things that obviously we know firsthand is the incompleteness of information that you have as a young person trying to make an informed choice. And what's even more worrisome are the people peddling some of these things where they don't have the proper background, I mean, not even from a professional standpoint, but in the way they're conveying it, where they're making it an emotional trigger response, where they're trying to appeal to a certain aspect of you to give you the impulse to buy, which becomes obviously super dangerous. So anyways, all these things, Eric, but I want you to kick it off because I believe you saw as an example, which is no surprise, that like Larry Wheels is an example, using this as maybe a minor case study, since the astounding fact we both thought was that from the age of 17, he's been on PEDs. And that, like, I would say, Eric, so now he's 27. So let's say, man, that's 2012. In 2012, that probably would be notable. Like a 17-year-old going on, notable. A 17-year-old, I do wish we had like the actual statistics, and it'd be hard to see it. I know this, at least in our cultural sphere, I do believe it's increasing, but I was shocked at the concept. Like, just imagine that, Eric. Like, walk me through that process. A 17-year-old that's thinking to themselves, whatever I have is not, like, you're not even done going through puberty, and you're already electing to make a choice that will permanently change your hormonal landscape. And that's why I talk about the incompleteness of knowledge. And like I joke about the lack of development of your brain, like not finishing it by the time you're 25. You're making a choice that will have long-term consequences without any of the real understanding of what those consequences would be. Like it's extremely shocking.
Yeah, I'm going to take you through my my lunch break between editing a thesis and writing my mass article for the month just a few days ago when this happened. I'm a subscriber to Alan Thrall's channel. I'm one of the 800K plus who get a great benefit from this dude's thoughts and experiences and shares and ideas. And he made a video called "Why Use Steroids?" Mm-hmm. And I was genuinely interested in his thoughts on that. For those who don't know, Alan Thrall has a really great gym in Sacramento, Untamed Strength, and he's been on YouTube for the better part of a decade. And he has, competed in local strongman competitions. He's competed in weightlifting. He's competed in powerlifting. He's gotten to the point where he's squatted over 500, deadlift over 600, in military pressed, I want to say close to 300. I probably am forgetting his overhead press strength. You can clearly tell that I'm more of a powerlifter than a strongman. But he's done a very good job. He's also developed an impressive physique. And he's drug-free, and will most likely remain that way based upon, if you watch this video. And it's a really good take where he was like, he just didn't see the potential appeal of why he would take it, considering if he doesn't have goals that require it, and like, what would he get out of it? He wouldn't be happier or see the world any differently or better if he had 30 more pounds of muscle, looked leaner, or could deadlift 700 pounds rather than 600. And those are things that they shouldn't need to be said, but they do. Yeah. Yeah. It's not gonna, it won't fundamentally change anything for him. He walked through some of the common reasons why people do it. Like, I want to look better, or I want to be stronger. And he was like, yeah, I can sort of understand the performance thing. And if that was my goal right now, to be stronger than I can be naturally and to try to compete at the highest level in strongman or just a higher level, then that would be a choice I would consider. But he was also like, I've got a kid. There are it's a drug. There are serious, potential health risks, and it's something that I'd have to think about. And he also mentioned how, like, okay, so if I'm relatively close to my natural strength potential where I am now in my, after as long as he's been training and how he's been, roughly around the same numbers for a little bit, he wouldn't feel the same kind of satisfaction if the only thing that changed is that he went on anabolics and then increased his numbers to wherever they would go. And he wasn't saying this how other people should feel, but he was like, I would be hard to come off knowing that, oh, what I've achieved is because of that, So the point was he'd clearly done a lot of thinking, and he mentioned it. And so then, of course, with the algorithm on YouTube, I click off that, I go back to my homepage, and I'm definitely not subscribed to Larry Wheels. But Larry Wheels, his thing popped up, and it's "I stopped steroids!" And I was like, all right, I gotta watch this, And I had the exact same thoughts that you did. Is for one, he talks about how he has been on anabolics for a decade, and he's 27, meaning that he was probably thinking about it and went on it while he was, not an adult. And you have to think about, what was the environment? What was he watching? Who was around him? What was social media? It's not like social media didn't exist in 2012, but what YouTube channels was he watching? It just makes you wonder, it must have been relatively clearly normalized, the downsides potentially downplayed, and then the upsides, relatively, emphasized, right? And then in the video, he goes on to mention how he doesn't really know what his natural potential is because he's never had that. And then I'm like, yeah, and I'm thinking, and you probably never will, because the next thing he says is how he can't produce testosterone naturally. He can't have a normal level. Again, there are serious consequences to using high levels of anabolics. And he mentioned, I've been blasting for 10 years, and now I have to be on HRT, testosterone replacement therapy, to be at a normal level. And I'm curious what I can do on HRT. And if you look at the comments, they're all like, oh, this is so brave. This is a good, healthy, informed choice. I'm glad you've taken this step. And on one hand, I agree. Like, it's good that he's transparent. It probably is a choice that is more responsible than what he's done previously. It probably will be better for his health. And I think it will be a different perspective for him that might, broaden his view and perhaps, hopefully, those of his followers. But then as soon as he mentions that he's going on HRT, what pops up but a mention that there's a link, an affiliate link to an online TRT clinic, and like it's the first link, so it's monetizing this video that encouraging people to get on TRT. And I'd be surprised if they even required a like an actual testosterone test in these consultations, man. Like shout out to Ben House when we did our episode on testosterone and TRT and how prevalent it is and how it really doesn't follow the guidelines that the people would expect. But he shared a lot of statistics with us, and I've read up on his articles that he's wrote on the sense. But there is a study specifically that goes into just how often do people meet the recommended guidelines by the Endocrine Society for actually, like getting the type of testing you need. So to get the right kind of variability and reliability in your test, you're supposed to have 2 morning tests of testosterone to make sure that we're not getting like a equivalent of a false negative or a false positive. And we have a good idea of your normal variation in testosterone. And only 4% of men in the US between 1999 and 2014 actually got 2 tests. And this one is even more wild to me. 2/3 of men who on TRT had no test at all, meaning it was just, here are my symptoms. So like, that's where we're at. Like, so the fact that almost everyone in kind of the enhanced world has these links to these TRT clinics where you can get it, like in some way it's like, well, at least they're getting it from a doctor. At least the dosages are and the drugs are perhaps somewhat controlled. But like you said, there's a difference between education and being informed and making an informed choice, and marketing and ease of access. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a little bit better than just getting it from a drug dealer, but in either case, you probably should have a much more informed opportunity. And if you are someone who's 17 watching this Larry Wheels video, you're just thinking, oh, 6 months from now, I can get on HRT and I can be like, Larry Wheels. And it's just like, it makes you think like, okay, well, what are the pressures that made someone decide that they needed to do this in the first place? And that's a complex question that I don't have the answer to, but it sent me through a little bit of holy shit, last couple of days, to be honest.
Eric, no, well said. Well said. I do think everything that you just vocalized needed to be said, and I'll add on top of that, just in the sense that both you and myself, we started lifting, right, in our youth. And you could just imagine as a 17-year-old, I'll speak for myself personally. I think I started lifting. I was like 18, like 17, 18. And if I had been exposed to certain different channels or gone down certain paths, and we see how the algorithm works, where it suggests certain things, and first year lifting, you see other people online. If I existed in 2022 as a 17-year-old, and there's all these mechanisms at play that then influenced me, where the comparisons would be so much more crystallized. When I was 17 and I started lifting, Eric, because I just had my other gym contemporary fellas that I was lifting with, everything was fine because my relative ecosystem told me the feedback that what I was doing was basically about right, that compared to my cohort, things were going well. So just in a small snapshot of myself, if I'm 17 in 2022 and you see online like 17-year-old kid, there's all these like freaks, like of course either they're genetic outliers or like facts, like this is the truth. There's a lot more, I think, of the youth today that are casually using PEDs without openly admitting it, and that's like that gray zone. And that's why, Eric, I love what you do, like everything like 3DMJ, what you do with your research and everything else, and like you compete in like natural body. And that's why I do think natural bodybuilding, we'll get to that after, it's like a question of integrity, right? Where like you want to have those rules, you want to play by certain rules because it is a sport. And then on this like wild side, it's the physique is a mechanism of earning money, earning respect, all these other accessory things. And if I was 17 in 2022, I don't know if I wouldn't be exposed to certain channels that then lead me down a rabbit hole. And then I potentially decide to become enhanced, or it's just TRT, bro. I'll phrase it another way. I won't expose this person. I always keep someone's conversation private that they have, of course, with me. But there's a friend of mine, someone who's a musician, who's like on YouTube, this and that. And I actually introduced them to the doc, Spencer Nadolski, because this person was considering going on TRT. They're in their early 20s. Some of the, like, let's say umbrella, once again, symptoms, Eric, of low testosterone they had. However, they did the T test. Spencer took a look at it. Definitely wasn't too low. What he basically was complaining about, really what he was talking about, Eric, is that compared to what he saw around him, he wasn't achieving what they were achieving. He did have a few minor health things that like Spencer saw, again, not to get into that were worth exploring, not related to his testosterone, but as a question of a friction between where he was and where he saw other people. And if I'm 17, the problem right here, and I'll end right here, man, is that we know this now. I can reflect now, over a decade after, and I know for a fact that being a 17-year-old or 20, like we're fixated on that age just because like that's when Larry Wheels went on, and I would say people are probably going on earlier. You could say 20, you could say 23. Anyways, at some theoretical
I can give you a personal example. Yeah. Like when I first started lifting in 2004, I was 21.
Yep.
And before I got exposed to natural bodybuilding, and it was like right at the end of the era of like the pro hormone era.
Yep.
I've shared this many times, and anyone who's been following me for a long time knows that very early on when I first started lifting, after about a year or so, I used a couple of different pro hormones over like a 6-week time frame in total, or maybe 9. I can't quite remember. This was 17 years ago. And then it wasn't until I got exposed to natural bodybuilding, and let's just say pro hormones and injecting yourself with testosterone are a different world. Like the whole TRT thing wasn't around back then, and I'm glad it wasn't, because it was basically the same mindset, right? So once I got exposed to natural bodybuilding, it just provided this new set of external standards and an outlet and a line in the sand. But there were absolutely consequences for me. Like I kind of felt like an outsider because I had, you could buy it from bodybuilding.com, these pro hormones, which is what I did. And once I found this outlet for natural bodybuilding and I find out like they have certain banned substances and some of the pro hormones were banned, some weren't, and some had like a 2-year ban for first time users, I couldn't compete in certain organizations for a certain amount of time. And anyway, it doesn't matter now. Like the WNBF has a 10-year drug-free rule, but it's one of those things that I do regret. And it doesn't come down to much where I look at myself and I'm like, oh, I think I would have done something different. It was just the timing of exposure. Like if I had gone to the natural bodybuilding show a year earlier before I had, learned about kind of the pro hormones and saw the forum posts about them, they would have been a little different. And like, it just perhaps would have given me more, I guess, realistic expectations. But I will say, I think the issue is not just the access. I think it is the way people see external pressures and that there is such an emphasis on these external, like what are normative gains or normative strength levels or who is jacked, who is not. And it may sound odd coming from someone who competes in a sport that's based upon external aesthetic ideals for your physique, but I really don't think it's necessarily a good thing to have this blanket, here's the way looking good looks for everyone to aspire to when they enter lifting. But at the same time, I'm not going to go to the extreme of saying that, beauty is entirely a social construct, that there's no biological basis. Like, humans, I do think we identify symmetry. There's probably some association between a certain level of adiposity, a certain level of muscularity with health and performance that may have some underlying, genetic components that people are drawn to. But at the same time, there is a huge social component, like you were mentioning off air. Like there was a time in like feudal times where someone who was overweight was like, oh, you're clearly rich, like gout was seen as like something to brag about among nobles, and so like corpulence is seen as something like, oh, that's the abundance. You're in the aristocracy, or if you look at different cultures in ancient times, some would have like the statues of Venus versus what you might see in the Grecian ideal. So there's different standards for beauty among men and women that have changed over time that are associated with different, economic and social status and caste-based systems that are, pretty varied. But I do think that you see some through threads throughout all societies where you can probably say there probably is something to do with biology, especially when you consider the rest of the animal kingdom besides, Homo sapiens. You think of other animals, you do notice that there are certain like mating displays that are, biologically rooted, and that there is a certain aspect of mate selection that has to do with, do I think we can, propagate the species and produce more offspring, right? And I am not going to pretend I know how much the social versus the biology comes into play, but I think we're at a point now where bodybuilding should be seen as something that if you want to opt into the competitive side, you're signing up for these ideals and you're probably doing it because you think you have a shot. But you do need to have this very strong separation between your self-worth and your own personal sense of beauty and the competition standards. And I think, and here's where it might have seemed ironic that I'm critiquing, external, beauty ideals as a competitive bodybuilder. But outside of having competition, I feel like that provides me an opportunity to create that separation. But I don't know how it's done when, like, that's not there. Like, if you're just being exposed to the quote unquote bodybuilding industry, like this is what they're the most popular. They have the most followers. You should look this way. And if you just simply don't have the structure or the genetics or the pharmacological enhancement to do that, how do you be okay with that? How do you get more internally motivated? And what's the actual problem there? I mean, I don't think we should go so far as to say we shouldn't put people up on a pedestal who have amazing physiques. Like I think the outliers of society, whether it's in sport, whether it's in any facet of society, that's interesting to people, and we put it on a pedestal as something to aspire to. And I think that in and itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there needs to be a real healthy, open, transparent, complex, and ongoing discussion about, what does that mean for the individual, so that they don't try to pursue things in a very unhealthy way that actually makes their lives worse in trying to aspire to something that they see as better.
Eric, this really is a monster episode. There's been many mic drop moments thus far because one, thank you for bringing up like you discussing your pro hormones, because I want to say, as an example, that's why I talk about the 17-year-old me potentially in 2022. It'd be all about that exposure, the societal expectations, where I see myself. For me personally, I think I've like talked about this before, but I used a fat burner when I was 18, that yohimbine in it, but my body reacted so poorly to it with the caffeine combination that it basically sat me out from any consideration of anything, like anything that I guess now would be like not water compliant or like potentially like further down the road illegal. Not because I had a moral dilemma, and again, the exposure of who you were with. I trained with a lot of football players, and like I naturally gravitated towards the more competitive people, right? And so it is theoretically possible that even back then, 18-year-old Omar, if I didn't react so poorly to this fat burner, and let's say it went swimmingly, like it went exceptionally well, and then someone else, like I trained with some of the linemen and so forth from the football team, like, yeah, like for recovery, I use this, and you normalize the conversation. I don't know any better. Like, again, I'm like 18 now or so forth, that I could have partook. It actually is hilarious to me, just that my body is so finicky that I took, so I'll say, and like, don't sue me or go ahead and try our Delaware company. It was that Hot Rocks that I took because I belong to T Nation, right?
I was wondering, is it hydroxycut?
Yeah.
Did you have the ephedra in there, or is this post ephedra?
Honestly, I need to look back. This is how bad it is, right? Because I just was reading the articles, and again, not blaming anyone. I bought it, whatever. And I took it.
That's a good point. To be clear, like neither one of us are absolving our own responsibility, right? Especially in our 20s.
Yeah.
But I will say that it's difficult to have the younger you are, I think the harder it is to have a view of the way you see things. Like that little monologue I gave about external beauty, like absolutely could not have done that when I was 21. Yeah. Like, oh, I can buy this on bodybuilding.com and I can make faster gains. And I hadn't been exposed to competitive bodybuilding, like natural bodybuilding, to know there was even a thing where this could cause me a problem later. So like, I'm not saying, and therefore like it's okay, or if someone feels like an issue with it, like, of course I'm okay with the choices I made, and it is what it is, and I've learned from it, and whatever. And I've always played by the rules. I've only competed where I'm able to, but I don't feel like I was wronged, but I just kind of wish I had just had a different luck, you know, where I had been exposed to in a different order of the same experiences. Yeah. And it would be something that, didn't cause this mild amount of discomfort that I have looking back on my past. So yeah, anyway, go ahead.
No, let me co-sign exactly what you just said, because there is that internal friction where I was like, my choice not to be enhanced. It wasn't that as an 18-year-old, it wasn't that I was just a student individual that could see like the potential ramifications long-term 10, 20 years from now. It's that like my first exposure to using another supplement other than creatine, or I did use like their Surge Recovery, which was like sugar water, like shout out. What was the Hot Rocks that then like it wasn't quite an arrhythmia, but the increased heart rate that would then the rapid onset, Eric, because again, from so many different factors going on at once, it lasted, I want to say 6 weeks. I stopped. It lasted 6 weeks where my heart rate would speed up all of a sudden onset. It could be at night. It could be at any time. I got the like EKG, a whole bunch of stuff, because again, I'm an 18-year-old. I'm like, no one on the forums are talking about this. All the reviews are 5 stars. I'm like, am I like what's right? And then anyways, you find this out. So all these things happen. Cool. You go off it. And so my exposure to like something that's sold legally is an extremely negative experience. Well, this then, it creates within my mind the narrative, which honestly was helpful for me, that like, well, you can't obviously trust everything you see on the internet, even if it's seemingly well vetted, where they had good articles and like this supplement, but this seemingly beneficial supplement that 99% of people have a very good experience with, I had a terrible experience with. Well, if you keep percolating up that ladder, what can happen? And like, is it really worth it? And I just remember, you know, obviously the sleepless nights, like a bunch of different things that happened, that it provided such a negative experience that it sat me out accidentally from going further down, you know, that conversation. And I wonder, like a 17-year-old Omar, were some of these conversations, like I know how gym rats talk to one another, and it's almost the narratives that they don't say that you pick up on. So it's the guy that's reminiscing on their glory days of being a competitive bodybuilder who is enhanced, who's now like on, in quotations, TRT, but they're kind of miserable, all their joints hurt and everything, and they're glorifying, and they have this nostalgia for this long lost, forlorn like past. But then you're reading between the lines, like something must have happened, like this, the combination didn't work out the way that you're describing, that you put the pieces together. But if you merely rely on your environment, probably like you're the temperature, so you're the thermometer, you're the temperature in the room, right? The ambient temperature in the room is what you are. Then you become heavily influenced by these things. And I think these conversations, I'll just leave it right, just for now, right here, Eric. I think these conversations are important because we both wish essentially we had a different roll of the dice of luck. And these conversations do propel things like the eventual environment, the influence it has on the average gym, right? The average level. We talk about the overall fitness IQ in the space. It is a normative thing right now, Eric, for people to talk about flexible dieting or counting your macros or some such thing. It is a normal thing for people now to talk about, you know, RP, or like, hey, leave some reps in reserve. Like, hey, compound movements are good. Or training for strength. Oh, you're a natural athlete and you do want to get big. It can be beneficial. All these things have percolated up. And so as you keep infusing the overall culture with some of these necessary conversations, it does permeate the overall system. And you might have some, like, remember, so as an example, like JB, where he had John Berardi, where it was happenstance, where he saw this big dude in the gym. He was whatever, like a lifter. And then he got that opportunity to train with someone at 5 a.m. that rapidly accelerated his training knowledge. Like, I'm talking a decade of experience within a 1-year time span. And that's a randomized event that occurred. And when we think about all the different inputs and outputs that influence like what we're exposed to, these conversations definitely do matter.
Absolutely. And I think when we think about, all right, why is it that, you know, 2/3 of men in the US, you know, at least according to, you know, the study that tracked through 99 to 2014, which, by the way, by Zhu and colleagues, Trends and Patterns of Testosterone Therapy Among U.S. Male Medicare Beneficiaries, 1999 to 2014. Why is it that 2/3 have not even had a testosterone test? I think it's completely down to the fact that the normative conversation, the ambient temperature in the room, is that TRT is a positive thing for your health in all cases. It's a normal thing to go on. It's low risk. A doctor's getting to you. It's easy. And the barrier to entry is low. And look at all these people on social media and Instagram who are promoting it. And here we are, you know. So that is, and it's because it's difficult. Like some people will put the entirety of the blame on the consumer, or the entirety of the blame on the marketing of the people doing it. And of course, anytime you fall on an extreme, you're probably wrong a little bit. But like if it was entirely based upon a word of mouth perspective and you know, demand and the invisible hand of the market that's just meeting the need of the consumers, then we wouldn't have that other stat that was brought up by Ben, which blew my socks off, where, you know, according to some reports, like more than 80% of men come off TRT within a year. So it's like, yeah, they don't know or don't think it's valuable to actually follow the right guidelines to get it. They're doing it because they want to be more muscular, more virile, you know, stronger or what have you. And then for whatever reason, it's not worth it, you know, the thing that they thought in the majority of cases. So it's a huge disconnect between those two things. And it's not over a massive amount of time. So I really do think it comes down to how pervasive and just the likelihood that you're going to get exposed to this if you're following fitness content, and the ease of access, and it just being something that is like it's a decision that should be far more weighty, that can be made with very little thought or long-term consideration. And here we are, you know. So it's and I do, like I said, I think this is a kind of a side effect of the pressure to look a certain way,
Yeah.
to be how are like if you lift to be acceptable once you've kind of bought into the whole like, hey, the iron game, you got to look a certain way or you don't really fit the bill. Yeah. And I think that can affect people who maybe just don't have the genetics, or people who just don't have the ability to objectively assess themselves and just are insecure. Because I mean, there's a ton of people I know who have a like pretty significant body dysmorphia who look incredible, you know. So this isn't something that just preys upon the people who aren't, you know, the natural, you know, Asgardian gods of physique development. So it's, I think the much more interesting and much more challenging question is, how do you promote aesthetics or strive for it in a way that respects individual differences and, you know, worth of the person, independent of some external standard of how they look, which we honestly have very little control over beyond just simply consistency training and, you know, having nutrition and all the things in place for decades, and then seeing what you get. Because if it's not good enough, you've done everything that the other person did who's looked great, but should you be less proud of what you've accomplished? Or should you be considering the use of anabolics? And I would say probably not. So it's a difficult conversation. And I think, to give it a historical lens, I think if we go back to the pre-steroid era, it doesn't completely solve the problem. Like many of these ads that I was talking about were in the pre-steroid era.
Yep.
It just reduces the magnitude of potential negative consequences that can come from this pattern of thinking. I think the more valuable thing we can look at historically was when aesthetics was integral and inseparable from, at least in our societal conception, of performance, strength, and health. So that someone who wasn't, you know, didn't have an excessive amount of adiposity, someone who had a certain amount of muscle mass, was also seen as someone who, you know, I eat well, I care about my health, I'm regularly physically active, and I can perform. I have fitness. So when all of those things were tied together, I don't think people saw it as so black and white, like, oh, the most muscular person is also the healthiest and the strongest person, but they understood that these were, you know, a big package together. And I think once people started competing in aesthetic sport, and there became pressures to separate the performance from the aesthetics, to separate health from aesthetics. And how do we just train for aesthetics? And I don't think that's an inherently, in all cases, bad thing. Because it has allowed people to develop more impressive physiques, which I think is cool from a sporting perspective. But I think it needs to be talked about and acknowledged. And I don't think like pure chasing of aesthetics is a good thing outside of competition, which is a weird thing to say.
No, Eric, we're going to get into that. And one of the things I couldn't help but thinking, that's why some conversations need to be a certain amount of time. And I was talking about that. There's going to be that video where I discuss like a TikTok or the shortening potentially of some of these conversations. I couldn't help but think, Eric, full disclosure, while you were saying that as an example, on TikTok, the mechanism with which something goes viral is that it needs to be a soundbite. It needs to be easily transmissible. So it needs to be a point, a message that isn't too complex, that can immediately be understood. Because if these platforms reward exposure, because exposure means engagement, watch time, and thus advertisements and compensation eventually, they want a message that can be shared a lot. And so that automatically reduces the fidelity of said message. And so as there's now an increased emphasis on virality, on things being shared, then there's thus a subsequent de-emphasis on the nature of the message itself. So how complex it could be, how nuanced it could be. So really we're dumbing down the overall average message. And one of my potential, before we talk about aesthetics, because I've been thinking about this, like what is it, like old man yelling at clouds? That's what I was joking about, like not TikTok itself, but just some of these platforms platforms or the way the content is consumed and rewarded, that's the more important thing, is that argument about, you know, like a lot of the responsibility, sure, some of the responsibility definitely on the consumer, but also, you know, what are some of these algorithms? Like, what are their intended function? Well, some of the intended function is to study human behavior, right? Emotional responses that we could agree upon that humans have certain responses to certain stimuli and whatnot, and then how to eclipse innate responses that the average human would have in order to keep them watching or how to keep them engaged. So algorithms are designed to eclipse, you know, your slower thinking part, to be like, do I really want to watch that? Like, as a joke, as a side note, Eric, like as a joke, it's like that steroid video with like Larry Wheels. It's a juicy title. It's something that pops up in the feed. YouTube is calculating on the next thing based upon what you just watched, which is the Alan Thrall video, what is more likely to keep you on the platform, and it worked, right? Because we're not in the moment. Every single choice as a human. I was
in the Matrix, Omar.
No, that so they've done some exploratory work down, let's call them in quotations, rabbit holes, and just think about the general concept of a car crash. No matter how logical, you know, well-reasoned you are, if you see it happen in front of you, you're going to turn and you're going to look. Now, your response after that, right? Like, oh my God, like you whip out your phone, you start filming, like where people, like they lose all sense of self. In the same way that if you understand some of the general responses that a human will have to different things, titles, a certain types of content that's being talked about where you almost can't look away. And those things, once again, because the express function of this is to keep you on the platform and is to essentially monetize it, your ability then to think rationally and then make a choice in light of these systems that are developed to basically defeat your natural responses. It's a heavy challenge. Like that's why when we talk about just in general, and I do want to go to aesthetics, man, because I know this is like far reaching, but the obesogenic environment, right? The concept was, well, it's just willpower. Like I feel that not only is it's not only an oversimplification, but it's an inadequate and erroneous explanation. And I think kind of like, that's why I get back to our 17-year-old selves, because we could both, or sorry, like you started like 21, but let's just say our youths where we weren't as nearly as informed as we are now, but certainly even from a development standpoint as a human, we weren't at a point that we could make really coherent, cohesive choices that we would be proud with long term. And then you're exposed to a system that's designed to basically gamify your responses and give you certain things. Oh, now you see a trusted figure that you thought like, oh, this guy's pretty cool, and it's I find it's kind of sardonic when you think about it, that an individual who started using at 17 due to societal pressures then creates content as a 27-year-old, then encourages the next generation to basically, like, let's just call a thing, Eric, that TRT, what you just said, 2/3 of people don't do, you said it was 2/3, Eric, of people that don't do any test, right?
Yeah, 4% get 2 serial tests, which is what the Endocrine Society recommends. And by the way, you can check that out in Basson et al., Testosterone Therapy in Men with Hypogonadism, an Endocrine Society Clinical Practice Guide.
Yeah. So the majority of people that
are... Sorry. 4% don't... Only 4% actually meet the guideline of getting 2 tests.
Yep.
And then 2/3 don't get any tests, which is wild. So it's purely based upon reporting the fact that you feel some of the symptoms of low testosterone, which of course co-vary with a ton of other potential things, you know?
Yeah. As that small sample, as an example, that person that I brought up, where they were having other medical issues that are basically influencing what would come across as someone just Googling, or depending upon who they're watching, as low testosterone or testosterone symptoms, which wasn't the case at all. But just think about that. Someone who basically decided to go on that, I'm not saying they regret it now, but they're going off due to health concerns, is basically providing a potential gateway for other people to make uninformed choices that might have long-term ramifications. Like, just think about that right there. I do want to stop though, Eric, just because like we spoke about that, but I want to talk to my bodybuilding god right now, which is E. Helms, just with the concept where you're talking about aesthetics right there, and you say like, you don't know if it's necessarily the right pursuit of aesthetics unto itself. If maybe if it doesn't have a competitive aspect for it, or if it doesn't have like a structure around it. Eric, can you talk first? Because I do find this conversation
I'm not even sure.
Yeah,
and I'll definitely talk about it. And I will say I'm not even sure on that stance, you know, like of what I just said 5 minutes ago, because I also don't think there's anything inherently wrong with wanting to look better.
Yeah.
Like, more power to you. Yeah. But I think the motivating factors and the underlying motivation I think is critical. And the definition of what you see as success, I think, is also critical.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the reasons why I like bodybuilding is because I find a certain element of artistic expression in it. And for me, it is, I have purposely kind of reunified some of those things that were separated as bodybuilding grew. Like when I first started lifting, I was like, I'm a power lifter and a bodybuilder, right? I like strength and I like aesthetics. And I saw them as separate because that's how they were presented to me. And like being a power builder is this new crazy idea that came out in the 2000s. Like, no, that's just called lifting weights before, the modern era, right? Like CrossFit is not revolutionary. It's a callback to the sort of the way things used to be, Anyway, so as I've studied history and I thought about what I appreciate, I've found ways to blend as an interesting and fun challenge these things that have become hyper specialized that didn't used to be, and trying to find the way that I can, have the least amount of negative downsides to that from a performance perspective as an athlete. So I think because I appreciate the artistic expression and because I'm interested in performance as well as aesthetics, and I have a competitive outlet that allows me to create a separation between my self-worth and that, for me, it's a largely positive experience, although it hasn't always been, which is the whole formation of 3D Muscle Journey, is how do we provide a community where we can nudge the needle towards, hopefully this, no pun intended, nudge the needle towards this being hopefully a more positive outcome for you, or providing a community where it's totally okay if you step away from competition or from it and you're still part of the community because you lift, kind of like here at Iron Culture for all lifters, if that's not the pursuit, because that's been negative for you, right? That whole idea of transparency and informed consent. And that's why I've written just as much about how do we optimize our protein intake as I have about how do we create sustainable nutrition paradigms for physique sport that are unlikely or have a lower likelihood of exacerbating existing mental health concerns, right? Or physical health concerns. So anyway, I think it's really important to have an idea, like I said, of what does success look like for me? And then I think it's also really important to have an idea of what is motivating me. So if you just want to look better, I think that's okay. But I think looking better should be tailored to you, what is reasonable, and it should be tied to health in some way. And I think a lot of the times what we consider like looking better, like my article, Can You Stay Shredded? And you mentioned how you made a video based upon that. Sometimes you'll see influencers who promote basically a body that for many people will require them to be in a chronic state of low energy availability. So like by default, it's requiring them to get to a not optimally healthy place and potentially less healthy place than they are currently, unless they're, perhaps very high in body fat or something like that. It's a different set of health concerns, right? So yeah, I mean, sometimes it's the motivation is tied to something inherently unhealthy, which I think is not ideal. I think it's okay in bodybuilding where we know we're pursuing an extreme sport. It's just like saying, yeah, of course, tackling someone in football isn't healthy, right? It needs to be seen in the same way. But I think if we're going to pursue this external idea of beauty, it should be seen kind of in the same way as like body modification. Like I want to get tattoos or earrings. It should be this empowering thing where I'm directing my own development. Or like Arnold described, a sculptor puts clay on the sides, I have to do lateral raises, that kind of deal. Like there was some element of artistry to it and, ownership and trying to create something that is visibly pleasing because it has an artistic element to it. And I think that's why I like the posing routine, even though it's not judged, So I think if it's purely based upon the idea that I was okay with myself until I was exposed to someone telling me I was ugly or not good enough or a weakling or what have you, which some of the marketing literally, like I described, was, oh, you're having problems in life? That's because you're a weakling and you're getting sand kicked in your face and you're not going to be successful and you're going to lose your girlfriend, right? And if you want to fix that problem that I just created for you that you didn't know you had, give me money and I can help you be more like the bully, right? Which is wild when you really think about the psychology underlying it. So I think Yeah, the idea that there is just that marketing simply taps into the desires that people already had. I think it also taps into the fears that people had.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're coming into this with a fear-based motivator, I think that's probably not a good thing. So that's probably step one. If I was to say, how can you have a pursuit of an external aesthetic ideal that isn't negative? Is one, it can't be out of a pure dislike or a motivation of hate. Like, you shouldn't be uncomfortable in your skin currently. If you want to improve, if you're currently unhealthy, and you want to get healthier, I think that's a little different, but that still should be like a approach goal, right? You're approaching health rather than trying to discard your current lack of health. I think that typically is associated with a better psychology. And then I think based on like, what is the goal? Where are you trying to get? I think it's really important to have a goal that is based upon improvement and having it somewhat open-ended to, I don't know where I can get, but if I improve from where I am, I'm going to be happy with it. And everything else after that is icing on the cake. But if you instead have something, and I think this goes back a long time, this isn't just like since the advent of muscle magazines. Like, even if we go back to the 1900s, where they were like, hey, here are the Grecian ideals. Or like Steve Reeves' book, like, hey, your bicep, your arm should be the same measurement as your calf. Like, that's just not feasible for some people, So sure, if you want to compete in bodybuilding where they actually do have to write these external standards for aesthetics, that's what you're signing up for. But being a bodybuilder doesn't make you a better person, like, so I think, and the interesting thing is, I think most bodybuilders, they don't get into the competitive side of the sport because they think that's the epitome of beauty. It's more about the discipline and the drive and the constant goal of being able to improve. And I think, if anything, exposure to actual competitive bodybuilding, not the marketing of competitive bodybuilding, creates that little more of a separation, So it's a funny thing. But anyway, I know I've been kind of all over the place. I don't have super firm views on this. I don't know the solution. Yep. But I definitely think that those two factors, having a realistic, more progress-oriented, based upon outcome-oriented goal, and ensuring that your motivator is one that is not negative, I think are critically important, so that people don't go to some place where they look back and they regret it.
To quote Eric, Chris Farley, the late great Chris Farley in Wayne's World 2, where Wayne asked him, he's a bouncer, hey Chris, like, how are you doing? He's like, great, life's great. He's like, I hate myself, I hate my father, I think I'm going to go pick a fight. And then he just marches off somewhere, where it's fascinating. But yeah, a fear motivator, 100%. I couldn't help but think that I'm a beneficiary of your work, as an example, where I spoke to you about in 2019, the sustainable nutrition paradigm, like just simple things like diet breaks, the concept of play I wanted to bring up, Eric. And so two things. One, time. That's
Chip
a
comrade
Chip,
in the house.
Oh no, bro. He's never far from us, right here. And then he's literally John the Baptist in the wilderness now, traveling all over America in pursuit of play.
He's literally in the wilderness.
Like,
yes.
It's amazing. Yeah. He's our guy. But I was gonna say that I think another reason why TikTok, and there's a reason I'm bringing it back up, but some of these pursuits, because a maturity is not allowed to develop over time, that needs there's a certain length of time, the time course that needs to happen to refine some of your positions. And I think it's a natural consequence of lifting over a period of time. If you're somewhat either introspective, self-aware, or just exposed to enough of lifting, that you begin to refine why you lift, what you enjoy, what you want to pursue. And I think one of the small missing elements from some of the modern environment, and I'll just speak for myself personally, the overall concept of play were what first appealed to me. And what I mean when I say this emphasis on play is that being having goals, being process oriented are all fantastic. One of the major appeals for me of getting into lifting, my brother was doing it. So there's a cultural aspect to it, where I came from a place of playing competitive sports. But here's the thing. you just look at the injury rate per 1,000 hours, that many other competitive sport, any other sport basically is far more injurious than anything that you could do while lifting. It's actually basically a safe environment. It's a safe environment to potentially participate with your homies or with yourself. It doesn't really matter, but in the pursuit of using your body. And I think coming from a place that in some way, shape, or form, either like sprinting or like soccer, like whatever, it doesn't really matter. I was always moving my body. And so that initial idea of, oh, I could do this in a controlled environment. There's easy ways to define progress. So like you're lifting and so forth. And it wasn't like oh my God, I didn't look at myself in the mirror one day. Like a lot of things in my life, Eric, it's extremely accidental. I wasn't looking, I'm like, gee golly, one of the things actually, that's why part of it was a little ego though, where I told you I sprinted against that guy who was like the fastest kid in my high school and I got dusted. And I was like, I am just out of shit. I was out of breath, like all this BS. And that was part of the impetus behind going to the gym, because I was training with my brother and we weren't exposed as much. There wasn't social media. And it says, well, how much are you like, okay, cool, you're doing that. And there was like that cultural aspect where you show up, you see your friends, you begin discussing it. The gym environment, because I was training also at the university, and then the other gym I went to was conducive to the process of aiming to improve without like the glitz and glam and like a lot of mirrors in the way and like, here's how you gotta look. So we basically, from the randomized experience of just living life, were exposed to a place where lifting in and of itself was fun. The rewards were clear, immediate, and observable. And we wanted to continue to participate, that created this positive response that kept spiraling forward to eventually then like it led to a career and all these other things. But it allowed me the time to then develop other goals rather than like, that classic meme, Eric, like my girl broke up with me. I decided I'm going to transfer. I'm like, please, sir, please stop. And that's why I think that's one of the things I see. Like I joke when I see about TikTok, is that these kids provide the shortcut of like potentially the PEDs, and there's like a lot of these SARMs goblins talking about it. And so there is no learning to be had. They basically want to go from point A to Z. And everything, like the overemphasis on self, the self story, like the narrative that you're the hero of your own journey, which could potentially be empowering, becomes like this meme of this like anime. I want to send you some of them, of like this anime trope of like, no one believed in me, everyone abandoned me. I've said I was gonna. I'm like, you're 19 years old. Like, no one actually hates you in your life. I'm pretty sure no one even thinks about. The worst part is no one actually even thinks about you, like in the first place. So you're unremarkable in every capacity because you're 19 years old. But I couldn't help but think that environment will not give them the opportunity to think about the things that then develop the lifelong pursuit of lifting. Because I think our hook, like I'm joking when I say this, man, with iron culture, and that's like aesthetics is certainly like a component of that, is that we're lifelong lifters, but we see the benefits from a health standpoint, and that's why I love what you said about tying it to health, that there's a lot to get from lifting, and a lot of it is over a long period of time, and it's not your superficial first thought of when you first start participating. It takes a while for you to discover it, and it's a personal process that you really can't like shortchange it, and someone can expose you to the right mindset, but it's something that you have to take onto yourself. You have to don the mantle, so to speak. So I just wonder, Eric, about some of the current environment not providing that opportunity. Like you had, like you train with your friends, you see the more experienced person, they push the ball forward.
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing, and not to go on a tangent about this too much, is that bodybuilding was born out of just kind of noticing these things the same way that you did in your start. Like physique contests, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, and how, Connor Heffernan has talked about, and we've had also, some historians, if you want to go back to like our first 5 episodes on to talk about it. Were things that were done after a lifting contest. They were the sideshow to a lifting contest that the lifters would participate in. And that's the same, because you'd notice like, we get all these people training for strength, training for athleticism, people in physical culture. They're trying to get stronger, right? And some of them just seem to look incredible. Isn't that neat, But people weren't really training specifically for specifically for hypertrophy until another few decades, 30 years after that, did it start to really delineate and separate. People were training for strength, and then the people who just had the right combination of genetics and training style that made them look incredible, they were the ones who also competed in bodybuilding. And when you look at the way the physical culture community celebrated that, they were just like, oh, wow, look at this specimen. Like, this athlete looks cool, you know? But it wasn't like, and now let's try to make more of that. It eventually got there, but it was this, we train for performance and health, and look at that, you know, that's kind of cool. Let's celebrate the human form as in its pursuit of strength. So I think I think you shared this on the podcast before, but sometimes when you would work with your personal training clients who had an aesthetic goal, you would get them to focus on performance and say, you know, if you build it, the aesthetics will come kind of idea. And I think it's not the 100% perfect reflection of physiology, but I think it is a generally good idea to view the aesthetic output of lifting weights and training and fitness in general, is that if you pursue improvements in health and performance, you're going to see improvements in aesthetics, which probably speaks to that slight, maybe biological tie-in between, you know, a certain level of health being something that's attractive across cultures, you know, with like, you know, symmetry and not being in the extremes of like extremely low body fat or extremely high body fat. But yeah, I will say that I do understand that aesthetics are very malleable and socially influenced, but I think that that's probably one way to do it. So I am grateful that from the start, the people who did influence me, to kind of get to your point in your question, they did have this blended power building-esque kind of more holistic approach, even though like I was interested in bodybuilding from the get-go. You know, the first competition I did was a powerlifting meet, and I was just generally interested. Like, I wanted to get stronger on all the things I did. The idea of progress is what became infatuating for me. So I think for someone who gets purely attached to the idea of sculpting a physique and looking better, I think that's a little probably harder to manage. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. But like, because there is going to be some degree, I think it's easier to find more opportunities when you have a broader things that you're focusing on, like adding a rep on your tricep pushdowns. But if that's not at all the focus and you just want your triceps to look a certain way, I think that can very quickly become body dysmorphia. Instead of being able to put it like, yeah, I want my triceps to look better, but I understand it's going to take a decade. I'm going to put that on the back burner. I'm going to focus on mastering more movements and getting better at those, and then nailing my nutrition more consistently. Like, I feel with the kind of focus that I inherited from the influences I had, and probably some natural predilection of the way I think, that I've had a vast opportunity of finding routes of feeling progress so that I get those same endorphin hits and I get this positive reinforcement of the behaviors I'm doing. Because aesthetics is something that is, it's a long road, unless, of course, you jump on gear super early. And even then, it's still a relatively long road, you know. But strength and performance can change rapidly. And I understand that's why a lot of people like CrossFit, because they get to go through that novice stage with a lot of different things. And they can kind of, when you have a broad focus, you have a lot of room to grow, and it takes longer. And someone could go, oh, that's less efficient. But it's like, well, you know, all these other problems we're talking about. But, you know, the funny thing, and this is something I wanted to talk about earlier, but, you know, we've kind of gone everywhere on this, is that even when you try to pin down aesthetics and you put specific rules to it, it is something that changes drastically over relatively short time periods. So, for example, competitive bodybuilding in its modern form as we see it, where, you know, men and women compete in the same show, has really only been around since like the late 70s, you know. On the men's side with the bodybuilding division, for a long time, that was all there was. You know, it was just men's bodybuilding. There was no women's competitions, or they were totally separate, and they were much more like kind of beauty focused. That was, you know, that's been around since the 1900s, and probably in a more, you know, format that we're accustomed to now, where there's no lifting component at all, since the, you know, 40s, 50s. But then since then, like if we just look at like the modern era, like men's physique, you know, with the board shorts and kind of looking like a fitness model, that was 2012 that got introduced. Classic bodybuilding, 2016, which is kind of saying like, look, bodybuilding has gotten to the point where it doesn't have the kind of appeal, and we want to make it look more like the 70s and 80s, ironically. So let's create that. You know, I think the first Miss Olympia was 1980. So, you know, women's bodybuilding took off in the 70s and the 80s, and then There was the, unfortunately, like now, like defunct fitness division that was pretty popular in the 90s, where there was an artistic and athletic routine similar to gymnastics, like floor routines, that was hugely popular in its era, but then has died off. And then you've seen also rapid changes. I think figure, which everyone's pretty familiar with, that started in 2003. Bikini started in 2017. And now, this is hilarious. After the start of Iron Culture and your joke about the wellness division, which, you've joked about just being like, this is not what the wellness division, like in actual competitive physique sport was. But in 2018, I remember the first time Omar made this joke of, I compete in the wellness division where I'm at a normal body fat percentage and I have, just to focus on health. Like there's no requirement to diet at all. That actually became a competitive division in 2020. And it's totally different to what you said. I don't want to throw any shade at the division, but I think the title is perhaps ironic, just being in the competitive sport of bodybuilding at all. But it's basically more muscle than bikini, but less requirement for leanness. And there's a certain level of acceptance of carrying a little more body fat and a little more muscle in the lower body. So I think the reason it's called wellness is it maybe matches some of the natural things that happen to women who weight train. Is they tend to be more muscular in the lower body. They tend to be a little more lower body fat dominant. So it makes quote unquote allowances for that. So I guess you could make an argument that that's, a wellness category. But of course, there's a lot of women who don't fit that mold, right? So anyway, so there's been a lot of changes there. And like you see, some federations don't have women's bodybuilding anymore. They just have physique, which is more or less women's bodybuilding. And then there's intermediary categories between like figure and bodybuilding, like fit body, or in the divisions, or sorry, in the federations where they have both bodybuilding and physique. Physique and fit body are very similar. Fit body's in the WNBF, for example. So like if you just look at the last 2 decades, there's been like 5 new like divisions added, and the rules themselves change in those divisions, so the idea that aesthetics is something that you can firmly pin down is just simply not true. And it's interesting. We're now at a point where, like before, the trajectory of men's bodybuilding was just simply dudes getting bigger over time as they take more gear and as the genetic pool expands, right? I think if you look from Lee Haney to Dorian Yates to Ronnie Coleman, is a very clear line where those guys are all roughly the same height. They're in 1 or 2 inches of height from each other, but their stage weights each time went up 10 to 15 pounds. Yeah. Over a sense of the 80s, right? So, but no one is like the competitors now aren't noticeably bigger than Ronnie Coleman. Like that's kind of, it seems like we've hit the peak of what the current crop of drugs can do. And if anything, there's been a push back against that level of mass, because now the bodybuilding division, I would argue in the mainstream, is not as popular as men's physique and classic bodybuilding, which is wild to me. That's a new thing. It has to be, because these 2 divisions have only been around for 6 years and 10 years. And and women's bodybuilding has been dying for a long time, unfortunately, as soon as other divisions were around. So it's a really interesting thing. And in my experience as a bodybuilding coach, when I work with people who compete in divisions that are very far from what the mainstream society expects, those tend to be the people who have, ironically, a more, I would say, centered and crystallized motivation and rationale for why they're doing what they're doing. Like, for example, women bodybuilders, in my experience as a coach, are pretty damn rock solid, despite the fact that physiologically they're undergoing more stress than a bikini competitor or a figure competitor, having to get a little bit leaner, having to diet longer. So, I wonder if there are parallels, like if you look at the men's division. I haven't had a ton of experience because those just haven't been around quite as long, and we don't attract quite as many of men's physique competitors at 3DMJ. And I haven't been, and honestly, also my coaching, it like kind of ended right around the time when classic bodybuilding started, and men's physique had only been around for a couple of years before I really took a step back on coaching. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with all this, Omar, but I guess what I'm saying is that if you're going to go with an external, idea of what aesthetics are, that can be a very, very fickle thing that you're chasing. And I don't think that's a very empowering thing, that you're kind of at the whims of where society and the industry goes. And making up new reasons to have body dysmorphia with every video where someone wants to sell you something. Like I was joking about blueberry arms, you know, a couple episodes ago. This popped up on the in the Stronger by Science group. Some ridiculous, you know, influencer made this video showing how like, oh, you don't want your triceps too big relative to your biceps, and he called it like a blueberry arm. And I'm like, that looks nothing like a blueberry. Do you even eat fruit? I don't know what you're talking about. And now you've got these, you know, like young dudes who are like, oh, I don't want to do too much pressing because I don't want to have blueberry arms. Like, dude, this guy made up this term yesterday, and the day before you saw that video, you didn't even think that was a non-aesthetic arm. Like, what's wrong with you? So it just kind of goes to show, like, if you want to have the empowering experience of lifting weights being something where you get to focus on progress and build your own sculpture and have this, you know, idea of improving your self-efficacy and being someone who has more ownership and empowerment in life, maybe that route where you're kind of a slave to the newest, you know, YouTube channel and you're getting pitched why you should be on TRT and yes, please click my affiliate link like every 10 minutes isn't the way to go, maybe?
Eric, so solid. Some would say rock solid, but I'm not surprised coming from you. Okay. I do one point I want to get back to. One of the elements I miss, and I certainly appreciate, I know you do, is the expressive nature potentially of bodybuilding and the form of artistry that posing allows. I remember one of the things I personally remarked to myself when I first watched Pumping Iron was Ed Corney, was his posing. Like there's an elegance and poise to the way that he held himself that clearly was an artistic form that he was doing. And I think it's like many other things that when you just call all the rich things, so we think about it like an iceberg where we just see the tip of it and you see the headline and they're like, I want that, I want the physique, because the physique means I'm gonna get this, I'm gonna get that. And I think like, look, I'm about to go off the tip of an iceberg here, Eric, and go full like lobster, Jordan Peterson, only eat beef and drink vodka. Otherwise, I'm going to have a depressive episode if I take one look at a piece of lettuce. Like, that's me right here in this pocket. But, like, if you think about it, I do think there's something to, like, what would be the innate biological response for, like, humans when they view each other or whatnot. It's like how lean you are or your physical, like your stature, your physique overall, is probably like a proxy for your overall physical prowess, right? So you're looking at someone's physique to try and determine their physical capabilities. So it's like, I have no idea. This is like, I very possibly am wrong with this, but it's like you're using it as a way to determine, okay, like how capable is this person then, like hunting, gathering, whatever. You eliminate all that, and then what ends up happening just on places, and that's why you spoke about all the many benefits you could get as a lifelong lifter. Like that's what we joke about here. But it's like, as an example, and you said, yeah, you could spend 10 years trying to get your physique, or like 1 year, or like whatever, like going on PEDs. It's the headline, Eric, where it's like you don't undertake that hero's journey. You just get the end result. So you get the shortcut. It's like doing the cheat code without developing all the necessary skills, the idea that you can persevere, the understanding of yourself, testing yourself through the waters. And it's not surprising that I said this in that upcoming video about TikTok, or just like the new generation. I've literally seen in the 2 years I've basically been off, like social media, like made some content, but like more observing than participating. I've seen people, Eric, on TikTok have a meteoric rise and then fade to obscurity for many different reasons, but their physiques have mirrored that journey. It's been a parallel to their personal journey of being a social media figure, and just how tenuous it all is, I find fascinating, because it's like the pitch that they're giving to the kids, let's say for their, in the pursuit of just like looking yucky or like aesthetic and like all the associated things that they get. It's like saying, oh, you want to eat really delicious food? It's like, oh, you don't need to cook. It's like, how you could just buy the course. It's like, you could just get the physique. Like, just buy it, just shop online. Like, you want a steak? You want a really nice steak? Just buy it right there, as opposed to the personal reward satisfaction that you develop from learning how to cook for yourself. From let's extend it all the way down. Like, you grow your own produce, you grow all these things, you prepare this meal, and objectively, maybe this meal, much like a physique that's assisted, might not be as good as that store-bought meal at the fancy five-star restaurant or whatnot, but you're much more proud of it. And internally, intrinsically, it's far more rewarding because it's something you made yourself. And so on the surface, they just see it, Eric. And I think that's the problem, like kind of what we're talking about here, man, is that they see the end point and they think that is a summation and that is thus everything of the journey. Whereas that's just an expression of the transformation that happened internally within us, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent analogy, and I like. Let me ask you this, Omar, because I've characterized you this way many times. You're a man of the people, you know, and you mentioned a number of times like people think about, oh, like I want to look this way because I'll get this, get that. Mm-hmm. How often? So I was thinking about this as you were talking. How often do you think they actually can articulate that you know, if I. Like I've heard many people say, for example, many young men say that, you know, I first got into lifting because I wanted to get chicks.
Yeah.
I don't know how far that goes, or like, because I've also heard them like, I don't want to get too big. Like I kind of, like in my era, it was, I want to look like, you know, Brad Pitt in Fight Club or something like that, or was it Snatch or whatever, or they wanted to look like, but it's always like, there was often, I don't want to get too big. I don't want to be too muscular. Like there was the goals weren't too unrealistic, you know, to be honest.
Right.
It was just like, I want to have abs and you know, and just whatever level I need to get to and the work I need to put in to be attractive to the other sex that I'm interested in, if that's the way they leaned, or the same sex, whatever way they lean, then that's what I want.
Yeah.
And that I think is entirely understandable, totally reasonable, and probably everyone who's lifted weights who is, you know, sexually interested has had that go through their head at some point. Maybe. I could be wrong. It did go through mine, although it wasn't the main motivator for sure.
Yeah.
But I think beyond that surface level thing, how often do you think people are actually like putting the connecting the dots, or do you think it's a little more subconscious?
Yes.
Like all this, yeah.
No,
well, anyway, go ahead.
No, Eric, I want you to continue, man, because my short answer would be, I think it's totally subconscious, that they're aware. It's kind of this vague, ephemeral notion that there's benefits to this. They can't quite articulate it. And it's almost like the responses that they give. And that's why I said the idea of like the bodybuilders that you observe at the gym, the narrative they talk about is not the same narrative that actually has occurred. It's like a choreographed response, what they say, Eric. So they'll just say it's like the all-encompassing, like I want to get the goils or like whatever, but really what they mean, and they're not even aware that they mean. And I like, this is a funny one, and like you get this immediately, that I think in the pursuit of, you know, yourself and transforming your body, there's a severe lack of introspection, self-awareness, all the qualities that we're talking about. So there really isn't a lot of time for self-reflection afforded. So no, the short answer to the question is no. I don't think they're aware of it. I think that's why they're doing it, but they're not aware why they're doing it, which is often the most cases for most people and most things.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me about how I pursued popularity in high school. You know, like being popular is, I don't even think most high school kids could actually articulate what it means or what's associated with it, but it's like, I want to be seen as socially acceptable, and I want to be liked. You know, I want to be cool. Yeah. What do these things really mean when we really drill down to it? Bro, come on. I'm 16. I don't know. Like, you know, like, and the kids who do know, who are, you know, far more advanced than I was even in my early 20s, they're not pursuing it because they're the unique kids who are like, oh, this is kind of gross and terrible, you know. But yeah, it took me till my senior year to realize that I didn't like the things I would have to do to become like quote unquote popular. And yeah. But you know, I was a late bloomer in many things. But yeah, it's just like I don't think a lot of people really think it through, but it is still a very strong motivator. Like if you look at the things that kids do that are really fucking mean sometimes, you know, or the experiences that many of us have had in various times, that in the pursuit of finding how do I become socially accepted, there's strong motivators, even though that people can't articulate what exactly there is they're chasing. So I don't think you're wrong.
Eric. I think so. We're always two steps away of a Lord of the Flies moment. Okay, like in any like Piggy, like on that deserted island. I am acutely aware of it. I will say very quickly that we're talking about this concept, and I love what you brought up about the goal of 3DMJ. I think one thing that we do have to discuss that applies to all pursuits, and that's why you talked about the concept of informed consent. Think about, I joke a lot about powerlifting because some of the spaces that I operate and I've inhabited are older places for powerlifting, meaning it's not the new crop of like more IPF oriented lifters. And as an example, if you wanted to participate in the culture of strength in the 90s, there are certain aspects of the methodology that would be disastrous for your body. And that wasn't, it's not like you look back, like let's say like your coach is Coach Bob, and like, I can't believe he did that to me, where like, you know, you like squat every day, or like you basically do things that are not conducive for longevity. And you do see the like old school powerlifters, like a lot of them are kind of beat up because of what they did to try and get strong. They didn't know any better. These things weren't systemized. They weren't openly discussed. And I think one of the things, and so I think it's natural because of what you said, Eric. I do think for any human, the goal of transforming their appearance in order to match how they see themselves is a natural impetus for most people. Like that's just one of the realities. And then what it becomes, and then you reflect on it, and then you try and pass on a transformer like 3DMJ, and that's what like powerlifting. I think it's the exact same thing. It's analogous where people want to get stronger. A lot of those methodologies, if you reflect back on it, they're not they're not ones that are once again conducive to long-term gains or long-term health. So you kind of divorce yourself from the overarching goal. And I think one of the things overall that we're identifying, like one of the tonics of this conversation, is simply that there is no exposure to either some of the, like we're talking about PEDs here, we're talking about the influence it has on the youth, then the cultural shift that tends to occur, and then what becomes generally accepted truths in the space. So like, let's say as an example, you're Venice Beach, man. It's like the 80s, you join Gold's Gym. Probably if you're at Gold's Gym, you're going to be hearing a whole lot of conversations, Eric, of people talking about like, oh yeah, like Pete, like whatever, like, hey, you feel good, look good, like whatever. It's going to be an environment that's going to inform you where it's like, oh, like there's probably no negative consequences. And so if you're looking at the average temperature in the room and where the conversations are being had, I think not only one, are these necessary, but the general conversation as a human in terms of why we do what we do, which should be always a pause at some inevitable point, is not only super necessary, but it's invaluable when we talk about the concept of trying to pass on. And I do like most things, Eric, that I talk about, I'm a shit disturber, and I would say I am cynical and I'm irreverent in nature, but not in a way where the intended consequence is a negative one. It's more, it's fun because the idea of it's very punk, like just to spit in someone's face, like call it bullshit when you see it, not hopefully hold yourself on a pedestal. But I do hope part of my hope of these conversations is that when we are gone, like who knows what will happen, not that like the legacy, I'm not talking about that, but everything contributes to one another to either push the ball forward or reverse it. And I have seen, and that's one of the things I'll say maybe in closing, Eric, like I have no doubt, like think how much you've influenced me, like the work that you've done, and then by proxy of that, like what I put out, and like that connected chain, right? This is not even a joke. There was someone I was filming, like that's what I told you, and I'm not trying to make this about me, but this is just an example. But there was a dude, we're filming with my man Walter. We're filming by the river, the TikTok video, and there was a guy. So he was driving a bus, and because it's on this place called Commissioner Road, and Nick is his name. He pulled over, he got out, but like just the conversation that we had, and I could tell like it's the through chain, Eric, of all the things. Like basically now is like pursuing like strength and like this and that, and like his eating habits. Like I am the conduit of these ideas, but I am not the originator in the slightest. Like I have been connected from all these things. And if we just think from the perspective of that interaction with Nick, how it's had absolutely positive impact on his life, training, and his overall outlook, and so on and so forth. That words do matter, like what we talk about, what we discuss, can have very large consequences for society as a whole. And that's why I will say, like, this is like me now getting off the pedestal. It feels amazing to participate in some of these conversations, man, to now be back on YouTube and so forth and try and take an earnest look. And that's like, we didn't talk about this, Eric, but that's why I'm so careful to try and keep some of my shit content up or discuss it, because you have to hold, at the very least, I think you should hold yourself to a more stringent standard than you hold others personally. But at the very least, you have to hold the same rubric. You have to hold yourself. And there are many, like, I'm sure, like, man, from a decade ago to now, when I look back at how many things I would do differently, not like large scale, but like enough. And then a decade from now, what that'll look like, that intent of trying to, you know, refine things and leave this, you know, world a little bit better. I think it's powerful, man. So anyways, I'm done. I'm off the pedestal. I'm now hungry for like the steak or whatever we're talking about, but I'm done.
No, I think it's well said. And I like what you said, because one thing I have very little patience for is when people like deconstruct the problems of society and then just, you know, like condescendingly look at it and nihilistically talk about, oh, society is shit, it's all just negative, and pretend that's social progress.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
When they don't actually acknowledge that there are neutral, positive, and negative aspects of society. And without actually thinking, like, well, how could we make it better? And what's realistic? And what's a pathway forward? You know, I think I'm not saying like all protest of society is bad. Of course, that's a necessary component to it. But I think there's a lot of people who will just simply deconstruct things and point out problems and sound very intellectual doing it. And they may even be right, but it's very one-sided and it's very rarely solution-oriented. And this is one of those things where the only way I can feel comfortable personally in this space and think about aesthetics and competitive bodybuilding and be on social media and be someone who displays my physique is to really think about this and make sure that, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not having a negative impact, because it's easy to do it. And I hope that if content creators, like you said, holding yourself and others to certain standards, if content creators hold themselves to a certain standard and have an element of transparency and talk about these things, then it will at least encourage that space to give yourself pause, to consider your actions and the decisions you make, so that it doesn't happen so rapidly and subconsciously at such a young age that you didn't really have as much agency as you'd hoped, even though it felt like you were making a decision. And you're not looking back with regret on where you were. So anyway, I think that's all I got to say on this topic, if I'm honest with you, Omar. And I applaud the listener who's made it this far, because we have been maybe a little all over the show on this show. But I do think we've talked about some very important things, in my opinion. And like I said at the very start, as a disclaimer, this is not the end of this conversation, and I really do want to make sure that we get other voices with different perspectives, because like we didn't even touch on the kind of pressure that women get to look a certain way, to be a certain way, and how more prevalent their issues of body image dysmorphia, body image issues and disordered eating patterns that are associated with it are. Although the issues for the men are on the rise, it's not like it's more important for one than the other. It's just very prevalent and has been around for a long time in women, and they are, you know, different because we have different societal standards for what the genders are, quote unquote, supposed to be. But anyway, I would love to continue this conversation, get some people on who are in this space with, you know, different followings and different perspectives, and who are just different people. And hopefully this is just the start.
Eric, truly beautiful. And maybe I'll just say in closing, my friend, that if you're feeling terrible about yourself, there is a solution. Our Masculinity in Crisis tour will be happening shortly in 2023. There is a reason why you feel like you're not at your personal best. It's because objectively you're not, and it's only through our careful guidance and leadership along the pyramid. You'll never be at the top, but you certainly won't be at the bottom. You'll be somewhere in between, depending upon your contributions. We will have that discussion. But that just makes sense to everything that we spoke about the conversation. I like some of these open-ended, and I call them exploratory, Eric, only because like we had some of the beats and some of the things that we want to talk about we didn't get to, but that's okay because the nature of the conversation, we're in simpatico with each other, you express an idea, it launches 4 or 5 potential avenues to go down. And I find myself remarking like it's a perfect time to stop, but I find myself remarking to myself while having the conversations like this could have went many different ways. Like there's a lot of different roads and avenues to explore, and maybe it's simply that I've taken a page too much out of my man Eric's book of just not muting the rest of social media. I really don't think, besides the sources that I really like massive or whatnot, I'm going to garner any more information that I want. But these conversations, I guess on a large scale with our 20, 30,000 followers, I don't see them happening as often. And so I do love to have them just because I think they are necessary. And it feels good. It's almost, Eric, a cleansing of the soul, a return to form, a restatement of intent, like coming back once again to social media a little bit more and seeing it and taking it. The thing I carefully want to avoid, because I now have a little bit more experience, is, as I call it, the old man yelling at the clouds, were one of my favorite quotes you've said, which, and interesting enough, it's one of your more simple ones in the sense that like there's a lot of powerful things you've said, but identifying a problem isn't the same as providing a solution. I think that's just a general quote that I love, but that is like 1,000%. I co-sign that. That's one of the ones. If there's the Helmsian quotes, like, you see on like Goodreads or like where it doesn't really matter, like that should be, and they upvote which one's the good one, or like which one they like. That one's going on there. Put it on the board on the Helms bingo. It's just an automatic straight line. You win. If you hear me or Eric say it, it's like whoosh. That's a win right there.
Hey, there's worse quotes to be known for, so I'll take it.
Eric, and the last thing I'll say, and then I really will wrap it up. I can't wait until we're definitely in an old folks' home, because we don't have no loved ones that were willing to take us in. So we're just there together, and we are playing bingo with each other, listening to old episodes of Iron Culture. But we're not really that like coherent, and we're not all together there. So we just keep yelling bingo at like random intervals, even though we're not playing our own game that we created 30 years prior. It's going to be good.
Glory days, baby. Glory days.
Hey, and then last thing I'll say, I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. And also, we do have fun interacting with you. We've been loving the reviews. Typically, people leave 5 stars. Hey, I want to read a 1 star. I'm going to be honest. They have, maybe because we've called once again the herd. I don't see as many 1 stars. Anyways, do your thing. Leave a review. We'll catch you every single Monday from now until the end of time.